The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Sarah Chen arrived at Forward Operating Base Artemis. The desert air was already thick with heat, and dust particles danced in the golden light that filtered through the base's entrance gate. She wore the same unremarkable uniform as dozens of other support staff. Faded green cargo pants, a standard-issue tan t-shirt, and scuffed boots that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn clipboard tucked under one arm. Everything about her screamed ordinary. That was exactly the point. Sarah had been at this for 8 years now, moving from one assignment to another, always in plain sight yet somehow invisible. She had perfected the art of being forgettable, the way she walked, the way she held her shoulders, even the way she made eye contact, brief enough to be polite, short enough to be forgotten. She had learned that people see what they expect to see, and on a military base, support staff were part of the scenery. They were the people who made things run, the background noise that kept the machine functioning. She walked through the main compound with practiced ease, nodding occasionally to soldiers who passed by. Some nodded back. Most didn't even register her presence. The base was massive, housing over 3,000 personnel in the heart of a hostile region. Tensions were high. Intelligence suggested that enemy forces were planning something significant, though nobody could pinpoint exactly what or when. The air hummed with nervous energy, with soldiers moving with purpose and officers barking orders that echoed across the compound. Sarah made her way to the logistics building, a squat concrete structure that looked like every other building on the base. Inside, the air conditioning provided blessed relief from the desert heat. She signed in at the desk, exchanging pleasantries with Corporal Jenkins, a young man who had been stationed here for 6 months and still got nervous around officers. "Morning, Ms. Dabba." "Chen," he said, barely looking up from his computer screen. "Supply manifests are on your desk. Colonel wants the inventory report by 1400. "Thanks, Jenkins," she replied, her voice carrying just the right amount of tired resignation. It was the voice of someone who had done this job 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times more. She settled into her small office, a cramped space with metal filing cabinets and a desk that wobbled slightly when she set down her coffee mug. To anyone who glanced inside, she was exactly what she appeared to be. A civilian contractor handling logistics and supply chain management, the kind of job that was essential but unglamorous, requiring attention to detail but not much else. But Sarah Chen was not a logistics contractor. She was a captain in the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Division, and she had been embedded at FOB Artemis for 3 months, gathering intelligence on a suspected mole within the base's command structure. Someone was leaking classified information to enemy forces, and that someone had access to high-level briefings. Sarah's mission was to identify the leak, document the evidence, and report back to her handlers. She had to do it all while maintaining her cover as a forgettable civilian contractor. The work was painstaking. Every conversation, every document that crossed her desk, every casual comment in the mess hall, all of it had to be catalogued and analyzed. She had narrowed her list of suspects to 3 officers, but she needed concrete proof before she could act. One wrong move, one slip in her cover, and the mole would disappear, or worse. She would. Sarah pulled up the supply manifests on her computer, her eyes scanning the data while her mind worked on a different level. She had developed a system for hiding her real work within her cover work. While reviewing supply orders, she was actually cross-referencing movement patterns and access logs. While typing up inventory reports, she was encoding intelligence summaries that would be transmitted through a secure back channel during her weekly equipment maintenance checks. Officers came and went, picking up requisition forms and complaining about delayed shipments. Sarah listened to them all with the patient expression of someone who had heard every complaint before. She made notes, promised to look into issues, and maintained the perfect facade of helpful competence mixed with bureaucratic limitation. It was just before noon when General Marcus Hayward arrived on base. Sarah had been expecting him. The general's visit had been announced 3 days prior, a routine inspection of forward operating bases in the region. General Hayward had a reputation as a details man, someone who noticed things others missed. He had risen through the ranks not just because of his strategic brilliance, but because of his ability to read people and situations with uncanny accuracy. Sarah had reviewed his file extensively and had prepared accordingly. She made sure to be in the logistics building when his entourage passed through. She knew the general would likely make at least a brief stop to review supply chain operations. It was one of his things. checking on the unglamorous but essential aspects of base operations that other generals often overlooked. At 11:47 hours, the general entered the building. Sarah was at her desk, head down, working on a spreadsheet. She heard the commotion in the hallway, the sudden snap to attention, the crisp voices of the general's aides. She kept working, playing her role perfectly. Support staff didn't jump to attention for visiting generals. They kept doing their jobs, trying to stay out of the way. Colonel Morrison, the base commander, was giving the general a tour of the facility. Their voices carried down the hallway as they moved from office to office. Sarah continued typing, aware of their approach but not acknowledging it. She heard them enter the main logistics area, heard the colonel explaining the supply chain protocols, heard the general asking pointed questions about inventory management and requisition delays. Then the footsteps stopped outside her office. "And this is our civilian logistics coordinator," Colonel Morrison said. "Chen handles most of our day-to-day supply chain operations." Sarah looked up with practiced timing. Not too quick, not too slow, and offered a polite, professional smile. "Good afternoon, sir." General Hayward nodded, his eyes sweeping across her office with the same systematic attention he probably gave to everything. He was in his late 50s with iron-grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in harsh climates. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing perfect, and his gaze sharp. "Ms. Chen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "How long have you been with us?" 3 months, sir, at this posting. 2 years total in the region. "And you're finding everything you need to do your job effectively?" It was a standard question, the kind generals asked to show they cared about support staff. Sarah gave a standard answer. "Yes, sir. The base has an excellent logistics infrastructure. Colonel Morrison runs a tight ship." The colonel smiled at the compliment. General Hayward nodded, already turning to move on to the next area of the building. It was a brief interaction, exactly as Sarah had anticipated. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Long enough to be polite, short enough to be forgettable. But as the general turned, his eye caught on something. Sarah saw it happen in real time. The slight pause, the almost imperceptible shift in his gaze. His eyes had fallen on her left collar, on a spot just below where a normal collar insignia would be. For most people, there was nothing there. Just the plain tan fabric of her contractor's shirt. But General Hayward's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The moment stretched. Sarah kept her expression neutral, professional, but her mind was racing. What had he seen? Her cover was perfect. She had checked every detail 1,000 times. There was nothing on her uniform that shouldn't be there. Nothing that would give away her true identity. "Carry on," the general said, his tone unchanged. And he walked out with his entourage. Sarah returned to her work, her hands steady on the keyboard, but her instincts were screaming. Something had just happened. Something had shifted. The general had noticed something, even if she couldn't identify what it was. She forced herself to maintain routine for the next hour, finishing her reports and filing paperwork. But her mind was already working through possibilities, analyzing the moment, trying to understand what had caught the general's attention. At 1600 hours, she received an unusual request. A young lieutenant she had never met before appeared at her office door with a message. "Miss Chen, General Hayward requests your presence in conference room B at 1700 hours. It's regarding supply chain coordination for the general's inspection tour." Sarah nodded, thanking the lieutenant, but every alarm bell in her head was ringing. This was not protocol. Civilian contractors were not summoned to private meetings with visiting generals. Something was wrong. She had 55 minutes to figure out what it was. Sarah spent the next hour in careful preparation. She reviewed every aspect of her cover, every document in her files, every interaction she had had on base. Nothing stood out as problematic. Her legend was solid, her background checkable and verified. She was Sarah Chen, logistics contractor, unremarkable and forgettable. But the general had seen something. At 16:55 hours, she made her way to conference room B. The room was in the command building, a separate structure that housed the base's operational headquarters. Sarah had only been inside a handful of times, always for standard contractor briefings. As she approached, she noted the absence of the general's usual entourage. No aides waiting outside, no security detail, just an empty hallway and a closed door. She knocked twice. "Enter!" came the general's voice from inside. Sarah opened the door and found General Hayward alone, sitting at the conference table with a folder open in front of him. The room was sparse. Just the table, chairs, and a large map of the region on one wall. No windows, no recording equipment visible, though Sarah assumed everything in this room was monitored. "Close the door, Captain Chen," the general said calmly. Sarah's blood ran cold. She closed the door but remained standing, her mind racing through response protocols. How much did he know? How had he identified her? And most importantly, was her cover completely blown? Or could she still salvage the mission? "Please, sit down." General Hayward gestured to the chair across from him. Sarah sat, keeping her expression neutral, but not attempting to maintain the contractor facade any longer. He had called her captain. There was no point in pretending. "Sir," she said simply, waiting for him to continue. The general leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp eyes. 8 years in special operations, 5 years with Dyer before that. 2 commendations for valor, 3 for exceptional service. You have an impressive record, Captain. Thank you, sir. Sarah kept her voice level, professional. She was already calculating exit strategies, thinking about what she would need to do if this went south. "I recognize the insignia," the general said, answering her unspoken question. He reached across the table and tapped a spot on his own collar, just below the usual rank insignia. "Right here. Most people wouldn't see it. Most people don't even know to look for it. But I served with Nightshade operatives in Afghanistan in 2019. I learned to recognize the markers." "Da!" Sarah felt her stomach drop. The Nightshade program was one of the military's most classified special operations units. Operatives were trained in deep cover work, embedded in locations where traditional intelligence gathering was impossible. They worked alone, often for months or years, gathering intelligence that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. And they wore no visible insignia, except for one. It was a mark so subtle that only someone who knew to look for it would ever notice. A tiny variation in the weave of the fabric just below the collar line, visible only at certain angles and certain light. It was meant as a failsafe, a way for Nightshade operatives to identify each other in the field if necessary. But it also meant that anyone who knew what to look for could potentially identify them. Sarah had forgotten about it. In 3 months of maintaining her cover, through hundreds of interactions, she had never once thought that someone might actually recognize the marker. It was supposed to be invisible to everyone except other Nightshade operatives or the handful of senior officers read into the program. General Hayward was clearly one of those officers. "I'm not here to compromise your mission," the general said, his tone serious but not hostile. "In fact, I think I can help you." Sarah remained silent, waiting. In her training, she had learned that silence was often the best response when your cover was blown. Let the other person talk, gather information, assess the situation. "I know you're looking for a mole," the general continued. "I know because I'm looking for the same person. Or rather, the same people." "This isn't just one leak, Captain. It's a network." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're running a parallel investigation." "Not quite parallel," the general corrected. "I'm running the investigation. You're one of several assets I have deployed in the region, though you're the only one at this base. Your handlers probably didn't tell you that I'm aware of your presence here. Need-to-know basis and all that." "With respect, sir, my orders come from Deputy Director Carver at DIA," the general finished. "Yes, I know. And Director Carver is taking his orders from me. I'm overseeing a joint task force investigating compromised intelligence across 3 theaters of operation. FOB Artemis is a key node in the network we're trying to dismantle." Sarah processed this information carefully. If what the general was saying was true, it meant her mission was part of something much larger than she had been told. It also meant that the danger was significantly greater than she had assessed. A network of leaks was exponentially harder to investigate than a single mole, and the chances of being discovered increased with every person involved. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. "Because things are accelerating," General Hayward said grimly. "We have intelligence that suggests the network is preparing for a major operation. Something that will compromise multiple bases simultaneously. We think they're planning to move within the next 72 hours, which means we're running out of time to identify all the players and shut this down." He pulled a photograph from the folder and slid it across the table. Sarah picked it up and found herself looking at a man in an officer's uniform. He was in his 40s, fit, with the kind of face that could blend into any crowd. Major Thomas Raines, the general said. Supply officer. He's been at this base for 11 months. We believe he's one of the key coordinators for the network here at Artemis. Sarah recognized the name immediately. Major Raines was one of her 3 primary suspects. She had been building a case against him for the past month, documenting his unusual access patterns and his meetings with personnel who had no obvious connection to supply operations. I've been watching him, Sarah said, but I haven't found concrete proof of his involvement. That's because he's good, the general replied, and he's careful. But we caught a break 3 days ago. One of our signals intelligence teams intercepted a communication that we've traced back to him. It's not enough to arrest him yet, but it confirms he's part of the network. The general pulled out another set of photographs. These are the other individuals we've identified at this base. Captain Lynn Foster, Communications. Lieutenant David Park, Intelligence Analyst. And Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Security. Sarah studied the faces. She knew all of them. Foster and Park had been on her suspect list as well. Torres was a surprise. She had vetted him and found nothing suspicious. Torres is their failsafe, the general explained. He's positioned to detect any investigation into the group. That's why you haven't found anything on him. She's been making sure you don't. The implications were staggering. If Torres had been monitoring for investigations, that meant he might already know about Sarah's real identity. It meant her cover might be even more compromised than she thought. Why hasn't he reported me? Sarah asked. Because you're good at your job, the general said with a slight smile. And because they're not sure yet. They suspect something might be off, but they can't prove it. That's why we need to move quickly. Once they confirm their suspicions, they'll either eliminate you or disappear. Sarah's mind was already shifting gears, moving from intelligence gathering to tactical planning. What do you need from me? General Hayward leaned forward, his expression intense. I need you to help me set a trap. We're going to use the inspection as cover for a sting operation. Tomorrow night, there's a classified briefing scheduled to discuss troop movements for the next quarter. The network will want that information. We're going to give them the opportunity to take it, and when they do, we're going to catch them all at once. And my role? You're going to be the bait, the general said. We're going to leak information that you've discovered evidence of the network. We'll make it look like you're planning to report your findings after the inspection is complete. The network will have to move against you to protect themselves. When they do, we'll have them. Sarah understood the plan immediately. It was risky. Using herself as bait meant putting herself in direct danger, but it was also elegant. The network would be forced to act, and in acting, they would expose themselves. There's one problem, Sarah said. If Torres has been monitoring investigations, he'll know this is a setup. Not if we make it look real, the general countered. We're going to stage your discovery in a way that looks completely natural. An accidental observation during routine work. Something small enough that the network might think they can contain it quietly. The general outlined the details of the operation. Sarah would accidentally discover a discrepancy in supply manifests that pointed toward classified materials being diverted. She would document this discovery in her daily reports, which Torres would likely be monitoring. The network would then have to decide whether to eliminate her immediately or to try to determine how much she actually knew. We'll have teams in position to move the moment they act, the general assured her. You won't be alone out there. Sarah nodded slowly. It was a solid plan, but there were 1,000 ways it could go wrong. If the network suspected a trap, they might disappear before taking action. If they decided to act immediately, before the teams were in position, Sarah could find herself in serious danger. And if Torres was as good as the general suggested, he might see through the deception entirely. But it was also their best chance to shut down the network before whatever operation they were planning could be executed. I'm in, Sarah said. The general smiled, expression of approval and respect. I thought you would be. We'll begin implementation tomorrow morning. For now, return to your routine. Act as if this meeting never happened. Tomorrow, everything changes. Sarah stood, preparing to leave, but the general stopped her with one final comment. Captain Chen, I want you to know that I've read your file thoroughly. You're one of the best operatives in the Nightshade program, but this operation is going to push you to your limits. These people are professionals, and they're desperate. Don't underestimate them. I won't, sir, Sarah replied. As she left the conference room and walked back through the compound, Sarah felt the weight of what was coming. For 3 months she had been a ghost, invisible, and patient. Tomorrow she would step into the light, and when she did, everything she had built would be put to the test. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah returned to her small quarters, a modest room in the contractor housing area. She sat on her bunk and reviewed everything she knew about the network, about her suspects, about the base's layout and security protocols. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. Either she would help dismantle a dangerous intelligence network, or she would become its next casualty. Sarah Chen, the forgettable logistics contractor, was about to disappear. And in her place would stand Captain Sarah Chen, Nightshade operative, ready to face whatever came next. The next morning arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Sarah woke at 0530, her internal clock trained by years of military discipline. She went through her normal routine. Shower, dress in the same unremarkable contractor clothes, grab coffee from the mess hall. Everything had to appear exactly as it always did. The network would be watching, and any deviation from her pattern could alert them that something was wrong. As she walked through the compound, Sarah noticed details she had overlooked before. The way Captain Foster seemed to track personnel movements from her position near the communications building. The casual conversations Lieutenant Park had with various soldiers, always seeming to gather information while appearing to make small talk. And most concerning, Staff Sergeant Torres, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His presence background noise until you realized how often he appeared in places he had no obvious reason to be. They were good. Very good. And they had been operating under everyone's noses for months, possibly years. Sarah arrived at the logistics building and settled into her daily work. The morning passed in its usual rhythm, but everything felt different now. Every email she sent, every form she filed, every conversation she had, all of it was being observed. She was performing not just for the personnel around her, but for the invisible audience she knew was monitoring her digital footprint. At 10:15 hours, she received a supply manifest that would become the trigger for the entire operation. It was a routine shipment list, supposedly containing standard equipment and provisions. But as Sarah reviewed the items, following the general script, she allowed herself to notice something she was supposed to notice. 3 crates were listed as containing medical supplies, but the weight specifications were wrong. Medical supplies of that type and quantity should have weighed approximately 200 pounds per crate. These were listed at nearly 400 pounds each. Sarah stared at the screen, letting her expression shift through exactly the right emotions: confusion, then curiosity, then concern. She cross-referenced the manifest with previous shipments, making her investigation visible in her computer's activity logs. Anyone monitoring her digital trail would see exactly what she was doing. The medical supplies were supposed to have arrived 2 weeks ago, signed for by Major Rains and distributed through normal channels. But if the weights were wrong, it suggested the crates contained something other than medical supplies, something heavy, possibly weapons, ammunition, or communications equipment. Exactly the kind of materials that might be diverted to enemy forces. Sarah printed the manifests and made physical notes, knowing that paper trails were harder to cover up than digital ones. She filed them carefully in her cabinet, in a location that was accessible but not obvious. If someone wanted to find what she had discovered, they could, but they would have to actively search for it. Then she sent a routine email to Colonel Morrison, flagging a possible inventory discrepancy and requesting clarification on the medical supply shipment. It was perfectly normal behavior for a diligent contractor who had found an error in paperwork. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent, just another day of bureaucratic detail work. But Sarah knew that within minutes, her email would be flagged by whoever was monitoring communications. The network would see her inquiry and would have to decide how to respond. The morning stretched into afternoon. Sarah maintained her routine, answering questions from soldiers who needed supplies, processing requisition forms, updating inventory databases. But beneath the surface, she was aware of a shift in the atmosphere around her, a subtle change in how people interacted with her. Captain Foster walked past her office 3 times that afternoon, something she had never done before. Each time she glanced inside, her eyes sharp and assessing. Lieutenant Park appeared in the logistics building asking about a supply order that didn't exist, forcing Sarah to spend 10 minutes looking through files while he made casual conversation that felt anything but casual. "You settling in okay, Miss Chen?" Park asked, his tone friendly. 3 months is about when people either love this place or start counting the days until they can leave. "It's been good," Sarah replied, keeping her attention on her computer screen. "Busy, But I like busy. Yeah. Lots of activity lately. I heard you're quite thorough with the paperwork. Colonel Morrison speaks highly of your attention to detail. It was a probe, delivered with a smile. Sarah recognized it for what it was, the network testing to see if she suspected anything, trying to gauge whether her inquiry about the medical supplies was genuine curiosity or something more. I just try to keep things organized, Sarah said with a modest shrug. Supply chain management is all about tracking the details. One small error can cascade into major problems down the line. Park nodded, seeming satisfied, and left. But Sarah knew the conversation would be reported back to whoever was coordinating the network's response. They were assessing her, trying to determine if she was a threat. At 16:30 hours, Sarah received a response to her email from Colonel Morrison. The message was brief and appeared routine. Supply manifest error has been noted. Major Rains will investigate and provide clarification. Thank you for catching this. Sarah read the email twice, analyzing every word. The Colonel's response was exactly what it should be. Acknowledgement of the issue with a plan for resolution. But the fact that Major Rains would be the one to investigate was significant. The network was keeping the inquiry in-house, controlled by one of their own people. That meant they were concerned. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon watching and waiting. The general had positioned his teams throughout the base, disguised as part of his inspection detail. She knew they were there, watching her, ready to move if the network made their play. But she also knew that if the network was smart, they wouldn't act immediately. They would wait, watch, try to determine exactly what she knew and whether she posed a genuine threat. The question was how long they would wait. At 1800 hours, Sarah left the logistics building and headed to the mess hall for dinner. The evening meal was one of the few times when personnel from different sections of the base intermingled freely, and Sarah used it as an opportunity to observe the network's members in a less formal setting. Major Rains was sitting with a group of officers, his demeanor relaxed and confident. He laughed at someone's joke, seemed completely at ease. If Sarah hadn't known better, she would have seen nothing more than a competent officer enjoying a meal with colleagues. Captain Foster was at a table near the exit, eating alone while reading something on a tablet. Her posture was tense, though, and her eyes frequently scanned the room. Lieutenant Park was nowhere to be seen, which was unusual. He typically ate at this time. Sarah collected her meal, chicken, rice, some vegetables that had seen better days, and found a seat at a small table near the window. She ate slowly, observing without appearing to observe, listening to the conversations around her. 2 tables over, a group of soldiers was discussing the general's inspection. One of them, a young private named Martinez, was complaining about the extra work it created. I swear, every time a general shows up, we spend 3 days cleaning things that were already clean, Martinez said, like he's going to check if the tool shed is organized properly. That's General Hayward for you, another soldier replied. My buddy served under him in Germany. Said the guy notices everything. Like, everything. Spotted a loose screw on a transport truck during an inspection, traced it back to a maintenance oversight that had been going on for months. The conversation continued. But Sarah's mind was working. The general's reputation for noticing details wasn't just military legend, it was documented fact, which meant the network should be even more worried about his presence on base than they appeared to be, unless they had a plan for dealing with him. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What if the network's planned operation wasn't just about stealing intelligence? What if they were planning something more direct? The general was a high-value target. His death would be a significant blow to military operations in the region. She needed to get this information to the general, but she couldn't break her cover by requesting an immediate meeting. Instead, she would have to use the dead drop protocol they had established. There was a specific location in the base's motor pool where she could leave a message. A particular tool cabinet that was checked every 2 hours by the general's security detail. Sarah finished her meal and disposed of her tray. As she walked out of the mess hall, she felt eyes on her back. Someone was watching. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the surveillance, just kept walking with the same tired, end-of-day pace she always had. The motor pool was on the western edge of the base, a sprawling collection of vehicles, equipment, and maintenance bays. At this time of evening, most of the mechanics had finished their shifts, leaving just a skeleton crew for emergency repairs. Sarah walked through the area as if she had business there, moving with purpose but not urgency. She found the tool cabinet, 3rd bay from the north entrance, red with white trim. She opened it, pretending to look for something, and slipped a small piece of paper behind a tool tray. The message was brief and coded. Storm may target Shepard. Storm was her code name for the network. Shepard was the general's designation. She closed the cabinet and continued her walk back to the contractor housing area. The sun was setting again, painting the desert in familiar colors. Sarah reached her quarters and locked the door behind her, finally allowing herself a moment to think without observation. If the network was planning to target the general, it changed everything. The sting operation would have to be accelerated or modified to protect him, but it also presented an opportunity. If they could catch the network in the act of planning or executing an assassination attempt, the evidence would be irrefutable. Sarah sat on her bunk and pulled out a small encrypted device from a hidden compartment in her boot. It was her only direct line to her handlers at DIA, used only in absolute emergencies. She composed a brief message, outlining her concerns about a possible threat to the general. The message would be transmitted in a burst communication during the next satellite window, in approximately 40 minutes. While she waited, Sarah went over every detail of her investigation again. The medical supply discrepancy, the movement patterns she had observed, the conversation she had overheard. Somewhere in all that data was a clearer picture of what the network was planning. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. Sarah tensed. Nobody visited the contractor housing area after hours unless it was maintenance or an emergency. She slipped the encrypted device back into its hiding place and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" she called out. "It's Torres, Miss Chen. Sorry to bother you, but we have a security situation. Need to verify that all civilians are accounted for." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the small knife she kept strapped to her ankle beneath her pants. Staff Sergeant Torres was one of the network members, and him showing up at her door was not a coincidence. She opened the door, keeping her expression neutral but concerned. "What kind of situation?" Torres stood in the hallway, his uniform crisp, his face professionally concerned. "Probably nothing serious. We had a perimeter alert on the eastern fence line. Could be animals, could be equipment malfunction, but protocol requires we do a head count of all personnel." It sounded plausible. Perimeter alerts happened occasionally in this region, but the timing was too convenient. "Of course," Sarah said. "Do you need me to report somewhere?" "No, just confirming you're in your quarters. I've got about 20 more contractors to check on." Torres marked something on a tablet he was carrying. His eyes swept past her into the room, taking in every detail. "You working late tonight? Saw you in the motor pool earlier." There it was. Confirmation that they were watching her movements closely. "Just taking a walk before bed," Sarah replied easily. "After 8 hours in an office, I need to stretch my legs." Torres nodded, seeming satisfied. "Well, stay inside for the next hour or so while we sort this out. Safety precaution." "Will do." Sarah closed the door and listened to Torres's footsteps fade down the hallway. Her mind was racing. The perimeter alert was almost certainly fabricated, an excuse to check on her and possibly to restrict her movement, which meant the network was moving faster than anticipated. She had less than an hour before her encrypted message would transmit, less than an hour before the general's team received her warning about a possible threat to his life. She needed to survive until then. Sarah quickly assessed her resources. She had the knife, her encrypted device, and her training. The room had one door and one small window that faced the inner courtyard. If someone wanted to get to her, they would come through the door. Breaking through would create too much noise and attention. She moved furniture quietly, positioning her desk to create a slight barrier that would slow anyone entering. Then she took a position in the corner of the room where she could see both the door and the window, the knife held ready in her hand. The minutes crawled by. Sarah controlled her breathing, keeping herself calm and alert. This was what her training had prepared her for. The moments when cover turned to combat, when patience turned to action. At 20:35 hours, she heard footsteps in the hallway again. Multiple people, moving with purpose. They stopped outside her door. Sarah tightened her grip on the knife. Then her encrypted device vibrated once, the signal that her message had successfully transmitted. The general's team now knew about the possible threat. All Sarah had to do was survive long enough for them to respond. The footsteps moved past her door, continuing down the hallway. Sarah heard them stop at another door, heard the knock, heard the same speech Torres had given her. They were actually checking on contractors, making the security sweep look legitimate. Sarah allowed herself to exhale slowly. Not tonight, then. The network wasn't ready to move against her yet. They were still assessing, still planning. But they would move soon. Sarah could feel it in the careful way they were positioning their pieces, in the methodical way they were checking and rechecking her movements and activities. The chess game was entering its endgame, and Sarah Chen was positioned right in the middle of the board. She waited another hour before moving from her defensive position. When she was certain the corridor was clear, she checked her equipment one more time and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would be critical. The general's inspection would conclude with an evening briefing. The same briefing where classified troop movement information would be presented. If the network was going to make their move, it would be tomorrow. Sarah lay down on her bunk, her knife still within easy reach, and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept working through scenarios, through possibilities, through the countless ways tomorrow could go wrong. She thought about the general and his reputation for noticing details, that tiny Nightshade Insignia that most people couldn't see, the slight discrepancy in medical supply weights that pointed to something larger, all the small pieces that, when assembled correctly, revealed the true picture. Sarah had spent 3 months being invisible, being forgettable. Tomorrow she would have to trust that she had been invisible enough, forgettable enough, that the network still underestimated her, because when the trap was sprung, there would be no room for error. The desert night was quiet outside her window, but Sarah knew it was the quiet before the storm. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. Tomorrow would determine whether she walked away from this mission or whether she became another casualty in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. Sarah closed her eyes and forced herself to sleep. She would need all her strength for what was coming. In the darkness of her quarters, the faint glow of her encrypted device pulsed once more. An acknowledgement from the general's team. They had received her warning. They were preparing their response. The pieces were in motion. The trap was set. All that remained was to see who would make the first move in tomorrow's deadly game. The day of reckoning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sarah woke at her usual time, went through her usual routine, and arrived at the logistics building as she had done every morning for 3 months. But today, every movement felt weighted with significance. Every interaction could be her last as Sarah Chen, the forgettable contractor. The morning briefing for the general's inspection team was scheduled for 0900 hours. Sarah had no official reason to attend, but she positioned herself where she could observe the command building's entrance. She watched as officers filed in, including Major Rains, Captain Foster, and Lieutenant Park. They looked professional, confident, showing no signs of the criminal conspiracy they were part of. Staff Sergeant Torres was stationed near the building's entrance, ostensibly as part of the security detail. But Sarah noticed how his eyes tracked everyone who entered and exited, how his hand rested near his sidearm with practiced ease. He was ready for something. At 0945 hours, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from Major Rains, asking her to prepare a detailed breakdown of the medical supply shipment she had flagged yesterday. He wanted it delivered to his office by 1400 hours before the evening briefing. Sarah read the email 3 times, analyzing every word. On the surface, it was a reasonable request. Rains was following up on the discrepancy she had discovered. But the timing was suspicious. He was creating a reason for her to be in his office, away from witnesses, where she could be questioned or eliminated. The trap within the trap. Sarah composed her reply, confirming she would have the report ready by the requested time. Then she sent a second coded message through her work computer, a simple requisition form that contained a hidden signal the general's team would recognize. They would know she was being summoned to Rains's office and would position accordingly. The morning passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah worked on the medical supply report, making it thorough and professional. If this was going to be used as a pretense to corner her, she would at least make sure the paperwork was impeccable. It was almost funny. Her last act as a logistics contractor might be filing excellent documentation. At 1330 hours, Sarah gathered her materials and headed toward the command building where Major Rains had his office. She had dressed as she always did, unremarkable and professional. But beneath her loose contractor shirt, she wore a thin Kevlar vest, not standard issue for civilian contractors, but Sarah Chen wasn't really a civilian contractor. And strapped to her ankle, hidden by her cargo pants, was her knife. The walk to the command building felt longer than usual. Sarah was aware of every person she passed, every vehicle, every possible threat vector. She knew the general's team was out there somewhere, watching and ready to move. But she also knew that if the network had planned this well, there would be a window of vulnerability when she entered Raines's office. She reached the building and signed in at the security desk. The soldier on duty barely glanced at her. Just another contractor with paperwork to deliver. Sarah climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Major Raines's office was at the end of a long corridor. As Sarah approached, she noticed that the hallway was unusually empty. No soldiers rushing to meetings, no officers conducting base business. Someone had cleared the area. She knocked on Raines's door. "Come in!" his voice called from inside. Sarah opened the door and found exactly what she had expected. Major Raines was behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Captain Foster stood to the left of the door, her hand resting on her sidearm. Lieutenant Park was positioned near the window, blocking that exit route. Sarah stepped inside, holding her folder of documents, and the door closed behind her. She turned and saw Staff Sergeant Torres standing there, having entered behind her. The 4 members of the network, all in one room with Sarah trapped in the middle. "Thank you for being so punctual, Miss Chen," Major Raines said, his voice pleasant but his eyes cold. "Though I should probably call you Captain Chen, shouldn't I?" Sarah said nothing, her mind calculating angles and distances. She was outnumbered 4-1 in an enclosed space against trained military personnel. The odds were not in her favor. "We've known for about a week," Raines continued, standing up from his desk. "Torres caught some anomalies in your digital footprint. You're very good. I'll give you that. But nobody's perfect. One encrypted message that pinged a monitoring system we have in place. One pattern of behavior that didn't quite fit your cover profile. Small things, but they added up. If you've known for a week, why wait until now?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her system. "Because we needed to know what you had discovered," Captain Foster answered. "And whether you were working alone or part of a larger investigation. That medical supply discrepancy you flagged yesterday, that was sloppy work on our part, a detail we overlooked. But it also told us you were digging in the right areas. We couldn't risk letting you report your findings." Sarah shifted slightly, adjusting her weight. "And the general? He's the real target, isn't he?" Lieutenant Park smiled coldly. "Very perceptive. General Hayward has been a problem for our employers for quite some time. His inspection gave us the perfect opportunity to eliminate him in a way that wouldn't immediately point to us. A tragic explosion during the evening briefing, perhaps. Faulty equipment. A terrible accident. These things happen in war zones. You won't get away with this, Sarah said. But even as she spoke, she was preparing herself. She could see it in their body language. They had no intention of letting her walk out of this room alive. "Actually, we will," Raines said, "because after the explosion and all the chaos and confusion, your body will be found in your quarters, killed during the attack, a tragic casualty. And with both you and the general gone, our network can continue operating without interference." Sarah's hand moved in a blur. The knife came out of its ankle sheath and flew across the room in a smooth, practiced motion. It caught Lieutenant Park in the shoulder, spinning him away from the window with a cry of pain. In the same instant, Sarah dropped low and swept Torres's legs out from under him. He went down hard, his head cracking against the doorframe. Sarah was already moving, driving her elbow into Captain Foster's midsection, knocking the wind out of her before she could draw her weapon. But Major Raines was fast. His hand came up with a pistol, aiming directly at Sarah's center mass. The shot never came. The door burst open and General Hayward entered, his own weapon drawn, flanked by 2 members of his security detail. "Drop it, Major," the general ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. For a moment, Sarah thought Raines might try to shoot anyway. His finger was on the trigger, his eyes wild with the calculation of a cornered animal. But then more soldiers poured into the room, weapons raised, and the mathematics of the situation became clear. Raines lowered his weapon and placed it on the desk. "Sarah Chen, you are under arrest," General Hayward announced loudly, for the benefit of any recording devices that might be running. Then, more quietly to his security team, "Secure all 4 of them. I want them separated and under guard within 5 minutes." The next few minutes were controlled chaos. The network members were handcuffed and led away, each to a separate holding area. Medical personnel arrived to treat Lieutenant Park's shoulder wound. Sarah stood against the wall, watching it all unfold, her hands shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. General Hayward approached her once the room was clear. "Are you all right, Captain?" Yes, sir, Sarah replied, her voice not entirely steady. That was closer than I would have liked. You did well, the general said. We were monitoring from the room next door, but when we heard Rains mention the bomb plot, we had to move immediately. We couldn't risk letting them leave this room with that information. Did we get them all? Sarah asked. We're rounding up the rest of the network now. Based on the intelligence we've gathered and the interrogations that are already underway, we believe there are 11 members total across 3 bases. With these 4 in custody, we should have the entire operation shut down within the next 12 hours. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the past 3 months settling on her shoulders. And the bomb threat? Already neutralized. We found the device they had planted in the briefing room's ventilation system. Sophisticated work. It would have looked exactly like an equipment malfunction if it had detonated. Your warning yesterday gave us time to locate and disable it. The general paused, studying Sarah with those sharp eyes that had started this entire confrontation by noticing a tiny insignia on her collar. You took a significant risk coming into this room alone. It was the only way to get all 4 of them together with evidence of their conspiracy, Sarah replied. If we had moved against them separately, the others would have scattered. This way, we have them all on record discussing their plans, including the assassination attempt. True, the general acknowledged, but it still took courage, or recklessness. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Sarah managed a small smile. I prefer calculated risk, sir. Over the next several hours, Sarah was debriefed by multiple intelligence officers. She provided detailed accounts of her 3 months undercover, her observations of the network's activities, and every piece of evidence she had gathered. The information she provided helped connect dozens of seemingly unrelated incidents across the theater of operations, revealing the full scope of the network's activities. The network had been stealing classified intelligence and selling it to enemy forces for over 2 years. They had compromised multiple operations, leading to ambushes that had cost lives. The medical supply discrepancies Sarah had discovered was just one small part of their operation. They had been diverting military equipment, altering intelligence reports, and providing tactical information that had put countless soldiers at risk. As the sun set on that eventful day, Sarah found herself back in the general's temporary office. The base was on high alert, with security protocols tripled and every piece of intelligence being re-verified. But the immediate crisis was over. The network was in custody, their communications shut down, their operations terminated. What happens to me now? Sarah asked. General Hayward looked up from the report he was reading. You'll be extracted tomorrow morning and debriefed at headquarters. After that, I imagine you'll be reassigned. The Nightshade program has several operations that could use someone with your skills. Back to being invisible, Sarah said, half to herself. It's what you're good at, the general replied. Though I have to say, your cover was nearly perfect. If I hadn't recognized that insignia, you might have completed this entire mission without anyone ever knowing you were here. Sarah thought about that. The tiny mark on her collar, visible only to those who knew to look for it. A failsafe that had turned into the key that unlocked everything. Sir, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When you saw the insignia, you could have simply reported it through proper channels. Let the chain of command handle the coordination. Why did you reveal yourself to me directly? General Hayward leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Because in my experience, the best operations are built on trust, not just protocols. I needed you to know that you weren't alone out here, that someone understood what you were really doing. And I needed you to trust me enough to work together when the time came. You risked compromising the entire operation by making contact, Sarah pointed out. Yes, the general agreed. But sometimes the calculated risk is worth it. You taught me that today. Sarah smiled at that. I think you knew that long before today, sir. The general returned the smile. Perhaps. But it's nice to be reminded occasionally. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 soldiers who had just survived a very close call, sharing the quiet relief that comes after the battle is done. For what it's worth, Sarah said finally. Thank you for noticing. That insignia, I mean. I'd almost forgotten it was there. That's the point of it, I suppose, General Hayward replied. A reminder that even when we're operating alone, we're still part of something larger. We're still connected to the people who trained us, who trust us, who will come for us if we need them. Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. For 3 months she'd been alone, playing a role, buried so deep in her cover that she had sometimes forgotten who she really was. But the Nightshade Insignia had been there all along, invisible to most but present nonetheless. a mark of identity that couldn't be erased even when everything else was stripped away. The next morning, Sarah Chen left Forward Operating Base Artemis the same way she had arrived, quietly, without fanfare, in clothes that made her look like just another contractor rotating out after a completed assignment. As she climbed into the transport vehicle, she took one last look at the base. 3 months of her life spent here, building a cover, gathering intelligence, waiting for the moment when patience would turn to action. Most people on the base would never know what had really happened. They would hear rumors about a security investigation, about some officers being reassigned, but the full truth would remain classified. That was the nature of this work. The victories were silent, the sacrifices unacknowledged. Sarah and the others in the Nightshade program operated in the shadows, protecting people who would never know they needed protection. As the vehicle pulled away from the base, heading toward the airfield where a transport waited to take her back to headquarters, Sarah allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the network and the damage they had caused. She thought about the lives that had been saved by shutting them down, and she thought about the strange twist of fate that had started this whole chain of events. A tiny insignia, barely visible, noticed by one man who knew what to look for. Sometimes the smallest details changed everything. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a nondescript office building in Virginia, going through her final debriefing with her handlers at the Defense Intelligence Agency. The operation had been officially classified as a complete success. All 11 members of the network were in custody. Intelligence gathered from their interrogations had led to the arrest of 16 additional individuals in other locations. Enemy operations that had been based on stolen intelligence were falling apart without the information flow they had relied on. "You'll receive a commendation, of course," her handler, Deputy Director Carver, told her, "though it will go into your classified file. Nothing public." "I understand, sir," Sarah replied. That was standard for Nightshade operations. "We have 3 potential assignments for your next rotation," Carver continued, sliding a folder across the desk, "all of them requiring deep cover work, similar duration to the Artemis operation. You can take 2 weeks of leave before you need to decide." Sarah opened the folder and glanced at the options. An embassy in Eastern Europe, a defense contractor in Southeast Asia, a research facility in the Middle East. Different locations, different covers, but the same basic mission: disappear into a role, gather intelligence, remain invisible until the job was done. She closed the folder. "I'll review them during leave and let you know." As Sarah left the building and stepped out into the Virginia sunshine, she felt the familiar pull of her work. The Nightshade program was in her blood now. She was good at it. Maybe too good. The ability to become someone else, to hide in plain sight, to observe without being observed, it had become second nature. But General Hayward's words kept echoing in her mind. Even when we're operating alone, we're still part of something larger. Sarah reached up and touched her collar, feeling for that tiny insignia that marked her as something more than she appeared to be. It was there, invisible to almost everyone, but present nonetheless. She smiled to herself and walked toward her car. In 2 weeks, she would choose a new assignment. She would become someone else, adopt a new cover, disappear into another role. But underneath it all, she would still be Captain Sarah Chen, Nightshade operative. And somewhere, someone might notice the insignia. Someone might recognize the truth beneath the disguise. And when they did, Sarah would be ready, because that was what she did. That was who she was. She looked like base staff. She looked like a contractor. She looked like someone forgettable and ordinary. But she was so much more. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. The story of Sarah Chen's operation at Forward Operating Base Artemis would never be told publicly. There would be no medal ceremony, no news coverage, no acknowledgement of the conspiracy that had been uncovered and dismantled. The soldiers whose lives were saved by shutting down the network would never know how close they had come to disaster. But in the classified archives of the Defense Intelligence Agency, in files that would remain sealed for decades, the record would show what happened. It would document how one officer's sharp eyes, trained to notice details others missed, had spotted a mark that shouldn't have been visible. How that observation had led to the exposure of a dangerous intelligence network. How a woman who appeared to be nothing more than a logistics contractor had been the key to protecting countless lives. And perhaps, years from now, someone else would read that file and learn the lessons Sarah had learned at FOB Artemis. The smallest details matter. The marks we carry define us, even when they're hidden. And sometimes being seen, really seen, by the right person at the right moment can change everything. Sarah drove away from the DIA building, heading toward 2 weeks of leave that she would probably spend preparing for her next assignment. Because that was who she was. That was what she did. She was Nightshade, and the shadows were where she belonged.